Children, till date there have been so many movements all over the world in which a large number of people took part so as to solve some problem, raise their voice against some injustice or to demand some reform. Well, if the citizens do not like something that the government does, they do have a right to speak against it and ask for a change. In today's module, we will learn about some of such famous movements.
The African American Civil Rights Movement was an ongoing fight for racial equality. Children, though slavery was abolished in America in 1865, but even then some Americans were treating the African Americans as second-class citizens. They implemented laws that kept black people separate from white people. Even black children were not allowed to attend school with white children, and if they were allowed, they were not permitted to sit in the first rows. There were separate schools, restaurants, restrooms, and transportation based on the color of a person's skin. The black people did not have any voting rights also. In the early 1900s, black people began to protest against racism. This was known as the Civil Rights Movement. In 1955, a black woman called Rosa Parks was arrested for not giving up her seat on the bus to a white passenger. This sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted for over a year and brought Martin Luther King Jr. to the forefront of the movement. King led a number of non-violent protests, including the Birmingham Campaign and the March on Washington on 28 August 1963.
It was at this march where Martin gave his I Have a Dream speech. This speech has become one of the most famous speeches in history. Those who attended the march hoped to accomplish, including an end to segregation in public schools, protection from police abuse, and to get laws preventing discrimination in employment. The march and Martin's speech were a success.
The Civil Rights Act was passed a year later in 1964. King Martin Luther is still considered one of the great orators of modern times, and his speeches still inspire many to this day.
Earlier, in the countries like USSR, the government was very rigid. It did not allow free multi-party elections, free uncensored press or media. People did not have the freedom of speech and expression or even free movement. Such governments were monarchical and wanted to keep a strict control over people's activities. People got tired of these restrictions and rose in rebellion. They wanted greater freedom.
Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a famous writer, and Andrei Sakharov, the nuclear scientists, were the main leaders of this movement. Because of these movements, a new leadership emerged in the USSR under President Gorbachev, who initiated a process of reforms known as the Glasnost. Between 1970s and 1980s, new kind of movements, those against the use of weapons and wars, started. The world had witnessed the horrors of nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They had seen the trauma and pain caused by the world wars. Still, countries like USA, USSR, Britain and France were trying to strengthen their armies, weaponry and nuclear power. People did not want wars. They wanted to live peaceful lives. Thousands of scientists and intellectuals from across the world campaigned for abolishing nuclear weapons and missiles and insisted that USA and USSR come to an agreement to end the arms race. The anti-war movement that developed to protest the Vietnam War was the largest and most influential in US history.
Some Americans were opposed to the war from early on. Many of them objected to the war on moral grounds, often because of the large number of civilian casualties. As US casualties began to mount and with no end to the war in sight, more Americans began to oppose the country's involvement.
Many began to think that the war was unwinnable and too costly. Many all over the America got united against the war, and this forced the US government to end the war and leave Vietnam in 1975.
But the race of developing nuclear weapons was still on. The countries were trying to create false rumors about the impending wars, increase taxes on common people. But the people were fed up of this.
They did not want war. They started protests and asked the governments to negotiate with each other rather than concentrating on developing nuclear power. As a result of these pressures, the main competitors, USA and USSR, started talking about cutting down their nuclear arsenal. Though the initial talks failed, but a treaty was signed by both the countries in 1991, known as the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START. Because of this treaty, more than 80% of the nuclear weapons were removed by late 2001. A little after signing this treaty, the USSR was dissolved and in its place a new Russian state was formed. This ended the threat of having another world war. On April 26, 1986, there was an explosion at a nuclear power plant at Chernobyl in Russia, in which several tons of radioactive materials were thrown into the air. Its harmful effects on human, animals, plants, and environment made people aware of the danger of the nuclear power. The economic and political changes since 1990s, which are also known as globalization, have adversely affected the lives of underprivileged and poor. They do not have access to formal education, basic facilities, and good jobs. With the expansion of the industries and commercial farming, the traditional farmers and tribal are on the brink of extinction. Building of dams and the relentless cutting of forests has snatched the livelihood of those who were dependent on the natural resources like wood and forest produce. Many people have been displaced because of this. These circumstances have led the people to start raising their voice against the current practices and demand changes in the vision of the government. This movement started as a protest in 1971 against USA for conducting nuclear tests underwater near Alaska. Volunteers set out to the test area in a small ship called Greenpeace and showed their concern. Greenpeace has become a very important international non-governmental organization and has its headquarters in Amsterdam, Holland. Greenpeace helps the people to voice their concern over the climatic change and environmental issue like ozone depletion and global warming to the concerned authorities.